I'd been working the night shift long enough to know when something wasn't right. The hospital corridors had their own rhythm, machines beeping in a steady lullaby, tired whispers of nurses trading notes, and the occasional murmur of a patient in restless sleep. But that night room 312 broke the pattern. Mrs. L, a woman in her late 50s, had just come out of surgery. Sweet woman. Grateful for every glass of water, every warm blanket. Her husband had been visiting regularly. Attentive, devoted, almost too much. Not that devotion suspicious, but the way his eyes wandered while sitting by his wife's side didn't fit the look of a worried husband. She came in 3 times that week. Blonde, mid-30s, soft features hidden under her surgical mask, but the way she moved said she belonged here. No badge, no stethoscope, just quiet confidence and a clipboard that was always empty. Said she was a close friend of the family. Except she never talked to the patient, only to Mr. L. I noticed it the second time she came in. Mr. L's posture straightened, voice dropped low, eyes followed her every step. He smiled differently around her, like a boy trying to impress, not a man sitting bedside for his recovering wife. They talked in hushed tones by the hallway window. Once he leaned in too close and she didn't flinch. People flinch when it's innocent. You learn to read things working in a hospital. Body language, micro-expressions, tension that fills the space between words. And this wasn't nothing. There was electricity between them, not the kind you see in family reunions or friendships born of hard times. This was different. Familiar in the wrong way. I didn't have proof. Just moments. Like when I came around the corner and caught them standing too close, her hand on his chest. His hand brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. It was fleeting but unmistakable. He noticed me then. Straightened up. Cleared his throat. She walked away without looking back. When I brought Mrs. L her evening meds, I looked at her with fresh eyes. She smiled and thanked me, her hand trembling just slightly as she held the pill cup. Her trust sat heavy in my chest. I nodded, returned the smile, and left quickly before she could see the conflict on my face. Later that night I passed Mr. L again. He was on the phone, standing just outside the elevator. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but the words weren't quiet. "Tomorrow night, same place," he said. Then he laughed softly. "She's asleep by 9. The elevator doors closed between us, but not before he glanced up and saw me standing at the end of the hallway. Our eyes locked for a half second. His narrowed, mine unmoving. I didn't smile. I didn't look away. It wasn't my business. But something about that woman in room 312 made me feel like maybe this time it was. The next day I checked the visitor logs. Her name wasn't there. No one matching her description had signed in. Technically that wasn't allowed, but people slipped through all the time. Still, someone showing up repeatedly without a record. That was intentional. I asked around casually. No one knew her. She didn't work here. She wasn't a nurse, tech, or even a volunteer. Just someone with access and a reason to hide it. I started watching more closely. Not just Mr. L, but his patterns. He always came in around the same time. Stayed for an hour. Stayed longer when she showed up. They never entered the room together, but their meetings were precise. Timed like rehearsals. Once he left 5 minutes after she did. Another time I saw them walk toward the supply hallway, then vanish from view. Too long to be talking. Too quiet to be innocent. Mrs. L remained oblivious. She asked about the weather. She talked about her plans for recovery. She told me how she and her husband had been together for over 30 years. How he still brought her favorite tea when she was sick. How they'd planned a trip for their anniversary next month. She looked at me like someone lucky to be loved that long. And I couldn't answer without my throat tightening. I found a reason to check room 309, the one adjacent to the hallway. The next evening I left the door slightly open. It was enough. I heard them. Not clearly, but enough. Her laugh. His voice dropping into something low and warm. The sound of a zipper. Silence. Then her voice again, softer this time, like a whisper in someone's ear. I didn't move. Not because I wanted to hear, but because I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They were having an affair inside the hospital, with his wife lying 3 doors away, barely able to walk. I stood frozen, caught between disgust and disbelief. I'd seen a lot working in this place. People breaking down, people breaking rules, but never like this. This wasn't desperation. It was betrayal dressed in routine. Later I found her ID badge left behind in the lounge, hidden behind a stack of files, like she didn't want it seen. It wasn't even hers. It belonged to a float nurse who'd been off rotation for weeks. She'd stolen it. That confirmed everything. This wasn't careless. This was calculated. I held the badge in my hand for a long time before placing it in my locker. My pulse was steady, but my stomach felt cold. I wasn't just a witness anymore. I was part of it now, complicit by silence. The shift ended like any other. But I didn't go home. I sat in the empty break room, thinking about Mrs. L and her soft smile, about how she deserved more than lies, about how sometimes telling the truth can hurt, but keeping it in can destroy. I didn't sleep that day. I kept thinking about how someone like Mrs. L could be so unaware while everything was crumbling around her. It felt cruel. The worst part wasn't the affair. It was how easily he looked her in the eye afterward, how confidently he played the role of a caring husband. He held her hand. He fluffed her pillow. He smiled like nothing was wrong. I watched him brush hair off her forehead, and all I could see was the same hand tracing another woman's skin an hour before. I started avoiding the room unless necessary. The weight of knowing too much made it harder to act normal. But Mrs. L noticed. She asked if I was okay. I lied. She told me I reminded her of her daughter. Said I had kind eyes. I thanked her, then left quickly before the guilt could show on my face. That evening, I printed a still frame from the hallway camera footage. One that clearly showed the woman with the stolen badge stepping into a restricted area with Mr. L. I didn't label it. I slipped it into a folder marked Patient Records, and placed it on Mrs. L's tray table during her nap. I didn't want credit. I didn't want to be involved. I just wanted her to see it with her own eyes. An hour later I passed her room again. Her door was open. The folder was gone. She wasn't crying. She wasn't saying anything. She just stared at the wall like she was trying to remember if this was all a dream. Mr. L came in shortly after. He sat down, started talking. She didn't speak. He leaned closer, maybe trying to explain, maybe to lie his way through it like he always did. Then she showed him the picture. He stopped mid-sentence. I couldn't hear what was said, but I saw him stand up slowly. His shoulders stiffened. He reached for her hand. He pulled it away. He tried again. She turned her face. There were no theatrics. No screaming, no slap, no demands. Just silence that said everything. And a look in her eyes that said she would never see him the same again. He left 10 minutes later. Walked out of the hospital without saying a word to anyone. I stayed at the end of the hall, pretending to check vitals on a clipboard that was blank. When he passed by, he didn't meet my eyes this time. He didn't look up at all. Mrs. L rang her call button that night just to ask for some water. Her voice was quiet but steady. When I brought it, she said thank you like always. But this time, there was something in her tone I hadn't heard before, resolve. The kind that only comes when someone stops hoping for an explanation and starts preparing to move forward without one. I nodded and walked away. Whatever came next wasn't mine to carry. The next morning, her bed was empty. Her chart marked an early discharge. No family member had come to pick her up. She signed herself out. No goodbye, no requests, no scene. Just gone. A nurse on the previous shift said she looked calm, bags already packed. No mention of her husband. I wasn't surprised. By noon, Mr. L's name was removed from the visitor list. He never came back. His calls were marked as unanswered. There was no follow-up, no drama. He simply disappeared from the hospital's rhythm like he'd never been part of it. The woman with the fake badge never showed again either. Her absence was quiet, like a secret evaporating into the sterile air. And just like that, the entire affair became something no one mentioned, but everyone knew. I returned to my routine. The days blended again. Meds, charts, rounds, repeat. But I was different now. More guarded. More aware of the invisible lines people cross when no one's watching. I caught myself studying people more than I should. Watching for patterns, changes in tone, the tiny betrayals hidden between gestures. I hated that. I didn't want to carry suspicion like a second uniform. A few weeks later, a new patient was admitted to the ward. Quiet man, mid-40s, recovering from a minor cardiac episode. Nothing critical. But he was kind. The kind that noticed when you were tired and asked how your day was. Not out of habit, but because he meant it. He never asked for more than he needed. Never expected things to be done faster than they could. There was a piece to him that felt unfamiliar. He stayed for 5 days. On the third, we spoke for longer than usual. About music, not medicine. About the way hospitals hold both the beginning and end of things in the same hallway. He said he'd been through worse. That sometimes the worst pain doesn't come from illness. It comes from the people you trust the most. I didn't ask questions. I just listened. Sometimes people say more in what they don't explain. On his last day, he left a thank you note on his pillow. Short, handwritten, folded neatly. It just said, "Some people still see clearly. Don't stop being one of them." Kept that note. Not because I read too much into it, but because it reminded me why I stayed in this job. It wasn't for the pay. It wasn't for the hours. It was for moments like that. Small, honest reminders that not everything is broken. Walking the halls after that felt lighter. Not because the job changed, but because I had. I'd watched love rot quietly behind closed doors, but I'd also seen someone walk away from it with grace. And maybe, somewhere down the line, that meant something could start again. Not now, but someday. And when it did, I'd recognize it. Because this time, I'd be watching for the right kind of silence.